My name is Renata Voss. I'm 34 and for 5 years my phone never once lit up with my father's name. Then, on a Tuesday night in March, it happened 40 times in under an hour. I was standing in my kitchen in Portland, rinsing a mug, when the first call came through. I let it ring out. Then it rang again. And again. By the 10th call I was standing perfectly still, staring at the screen, watching his name appear and disappear like something trying to break through a locked door. By the 40th I finally understood that whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop until I answered it. Before I tell you what was on the other end of that phone, tell me, what time is it where you're watching this from? I want to know how far this one travels. People imagine no contact as something dramatic. A screaming match, a slammed door, a scene everyone remembers. Mine wasn't like that. Mine was quiet. I sent one email 5 years ago, explaining that I needed space and would reach out when I was ready. Nobody argued. Nobody pushed back. The silence that followed felt less like a fight and more like both sides quietly agreeing that the relationship had already been over for years, and we were just finally admitting it out loud. I'm a physical therapist who specializes in post-surgical recovery, mostly orthopedic patients, hips, knees, spines. Slow work. You don't fix people in a day. You show up session after session, and you teach a body how to trust itself again after something has broken it. I'm good at it. I built a small private practice from nothing, in a city 1,000 miles from where I grew up, and for 5 years that practice and my husband, Theo, and our quiet apartment with too many plants were the whole of my life. I didn't miss my family. I want to be honest about that because the honest version of this story only makes sense if you understand I wasn't waiting by the phone. I had grieved them the way you grieve someone who's still alive, which is its own particular kind of loneliness, and then I had stopped grieving. I was genuinely done. To understand why I left, you have to understand the roles we were all assigned before any of us were old enough to choose them. My father, Gerald, ran a small auto parts store that never quite made enough money, and he managed that shortfall the way a lot of men of his generation did, by treating vulnerability as something other people could afford and he couldn't. My mother, Pam, kept the peace by keeping score, tallying who had done what for whom, cashing those tallies in during arguments years later like currency that never expired. And then there was me and my older brother, Curtis. Curtis got to be a person in that house, moody, unreliable, forgiven. I got to be useful. When my father's knee gave out from years of standing on concrete floors, I was the one who researched physical therapists, drove him to appointments, learned the exercises alongside him so I could make sure he did them right at home. I was 17. That was, looking back, probably the beginning of the career I'd eventually build. Except nobody in that house ever framed it as a beginning. They framed it as my job. By the time I was 26, I had spent nearly a decade being the family's default solution to every problem that required competence, patience, or unpaid labor. When I finally said no to something, moving back home to help manage a family financial mess that had nothing to do with me, my mother cried, my father didn't speak to me for a month, and Curtis told me I'd always thought I was better than the rest of them. I hadn't. I had just, for the first time, understood that I was allowed to say no. I left. Not in a blaze of confrontation. I just stopped reaching out and let their silence, which they'd trained into me for years, finally work in the other direction. That Tuesday night after the 40th call, I finally picked up. It was my mother, and her voice had a wetness to it I hadn't heard in 5 years. Not anger, which is what I'd braced for, but something closer to panic. She told me my father had been diagnosed with congestive heart failure 8 months earlier. 8 months. Not 5 years of silence broken by a diagnosis. A diagnosis that had existed for the better part of a year, managed and hidden and worsening, before anyone thought to tell me. What had changed that Tuesday wasn't the diagnosis. It was that he'd been rushed to the hospital that afternoon after his heart rhythm became unstable, and the cardiologist had used the word weeks for the first time. Not months. Weeks. My mother didn't lead with any of that, though. She led with, "You're a physical therapist, you understand medical things, we need you to come talk to his doctors because your brother and I don't understand what they're saying. Not we miss you. Not I'm sorry it took this. Just, we need someone competent to manage this, and you're the only one qualified." I sat with the phone against my ear in my quiet kitchen, and I felt the exact shape of the old trap closing around me again. Except this time I could see the metal for what it was. I didn't decide that night. I told my mother I needed to think, which made her go quiet in a way that told me thinking had never been an acceptable response in that family. You were supposed to act immediately the moment you were needed. Theo found me still standing in the kitchen an hour later. He didn't tell me what to do. He just asked what I was afraid of, and I realized the honest answer wasn't that I was afraid of seeing my father dying. I was afraid of who I'd become the moment I walked back into that house. That the version of me who knew how to say no would simply dissolve back into the version who'd spent a decade being useful in exchange for scraps of approval. I booked a flight 2 days later. But I want you to understand exactly how I booked it, because this detail matters for everything that follows. I didn't buy an open-ended ticket. I bought a round trip with a return date 12 days out, and I printed the boarding pass, the physical paper kind, and folded it into the inside pocket of my jacket over my chest where I could feel the edge of it. It wasn't sentimental. It was a decision I'd made in advance, written down where I couldn't argue myself out of it later. I was going as a physical therapist with medical knowledge who happened to be his daughter. I was not moving home. There was already a day chosen when I would leave, and it did not depend on how much they needed me, or how guilty they made me feel, or how sad the house was. I told Theo, half as a promise and half as a test. If they try to take this ticket away from me, literally or otherwise, that's how I'll know I was right to leave in the first place. Curtis picked me up at the airport, and before we'd even left the parking garage, the briefing began. Not how are you, not thank you for coming logistics. Mom can't handle the nights. There's a stack of medical bills. I put you in your old room since you'll probably be here a while. A while. I noticed that word land. 12 days quietly rounded up into an indefinite stay before I'd even set my bag down. The house was unchanged in the specific way that feels like violence. Same creak on the fourth stair. Same smell of coffee and something underneath it I never had a name for except childhood. My mother met me at the door, took my face in both hands and cried. And for one unguarded second it almost felt like what a homecoming is supposed to feel like. Then with her hand still on my face she said, "Thank God you're here. Can you look at his medications? Nobody explains anything to us properly. Not I missed you. Not I'm sorry it took this." The ask before I'd even taken off my coat. My father had always been a large man, built like the auto parts he sold, and heart failure had folded him into something smaller, swollen ankles, breath that came in short unfinished sentences, skin gone the color of old paper. When I walked into the room he looked at me for a long moment, and I let myself hope, the way you hope even when you know better, that the first thing he'd say after 5 years would be something like an apology, or even just my name spoken gently. What he said was, "Good you're here. Your mother can't read a discharge summary to save her life." That was the whole reunion. Not a daughter who'd come home. A competent person who'd finally arrived to manage the incompetence of everyone else. I felt the old reflex pull at me immediately, and before I'd consciously decided anything, I was already reading his chart, cross-referencing his medication list, calling his cardiologist's office to ask questions my mother hadn't thought to ask. That's the thing about training like mine. It lives below conscious thought. I had sworn I would never let this family use me again, and within an hour of walking through the door, my hands were already doing exactly what they'd been trained to do since I was 17. By the third day, I had actually made things better, corrected a medication timing error that had been leaving him breathless and panicked for hours at a stretch, taught my mother how to help him move without straining his heart, gotten him comfortable enough to sleep through a full night for the first time in weeks. And the family's response to my competence wasn't gratitude. It was appetite. My mother appeared one morning with a folder. Not old photos, paperwork. Medical bills overdue. A form with a sticky arrow pointing to a signature line that would make me financially responsible for his ongoing care. "Curtis can't take on more hours," she explained, in the patient voice you use with someone being difficult. "We just need someone reliable with a steady income." Reliable. That word had always meant me. Death, apparently, was no reason to reorganize the family's assumptions. I read the whole folder slowly, the way I read a doctor's orders before I follow them, and then I set the pen down without signing. "I'll take care of him," I said. "I'll do it for free with my own hands for as long as I'm here. That's a gift and I'm choosing to give it. But I'm not signing this. I'm not taking on his debt. I'm not staying past the 12th day." My mother's face did something complicated. Relief curdling into something colder as she recalculated. Right in front of me, How to get a better grip on a tool that had just declined to be fully claimed. It was Curtis who found the ticket, going through my coat pocket looking for my rental car keys. He held the folded boarding pass up like evidence of a crime. You bought a flight home? He's dying and you've got an exit planned. As if a woman who had crossed the country to sit with her dying father was somehow the villain for also intending, one day, to leave. I took the boarding pass back from him gently, folded it along its original creases, and put it back in my coat, over my chest, and felt something settle in me, cold and clear. They'd gone for the ticket exactly the way I'd predicted they would. That was how I knew all the way down that I'd been right to leave 5 years earlier, and right to protect this return date now. On the 9th day the signs started, the ones I recognized from years of clinical training even though this was cardiac and not the hospice work I do now think about often since. His breathing changed shape. He slept more, surfaced less. I told the family gently that there might be one more clear window, an afternoon or an hour where he'd be lucid enough to speak, and after that there might not be another chance. They gathered. My mother closest, holding his hand, Curtis at the foot of the bed, and me in the corner, occupying the 2 roles I'd occupied my whole life at once, the clinician monitoring his vitals, and the daughter still, embarrassingly, hoping. His eyes opened, clear for the first time in days. They moved across the room and landed on me last. I stopped breathing. Whatever he said now would be the last thing he ever said to me, and some stubborn part of me, even after everything, still hoped it would be an apology. He gathered his strength and said, "You should move back. Take care of your mother when I'm gone. You're the strong one. It's what you're for. Not who you are. What you're for." Even here at the very end, with everything else stripped away, the truest thing my father could offer his estranged daughter was a job assignment, delivered almost tenderly, as if being useful was a gift he was handing me rather than the yoke it had always been. He genuinely didn't know the difference. He never had. My mother reached for the folder on the side table, sliding it toward me across his blanket. "It's his last wish, Renata. Just sign it." I looked at the pen. I looked at my father's waiting face. And I understood with total clarity that this was the whole of my childhood laid out one final time on a dying man's blanket. The chance to earn the belonging I'd wanted my entire life, if I would just pick up the pen and dissolve back into being what I was for. I didn't sign it. I set my hand over his instead, warm over cold, and said quietly, "I'm going to give you the best care I know how to give, for as long as you have left. That's a gift and I'm choosing it freely. But love isn't something you get to bill me for." I nursed him through the final hours myself, adjusted his medication timing, kept my mother's voice low, held his hand as his breathing gentled and finally stopped, a little after 2 in the morning. I gave my father a good death because I chose to, not because I owed it, and in that same quiet room, I let go of the apology that was never coming. The house filled with the sounds a death makes. My mother's crying, Curtis on the phone with the funeral home, the machinery of a family closing ranks around what comes next. I felt the old current start to pull at me immediately, the assumption humming under everything that of course I'd stay now. Of course I'd manage the funeral and the bills and my mother's grief the way I'd managed everything else. I took my boarding pass out of my coat instead. Curtis saw it and blocked the doorway. "He's not even cold and you're leaving?" I didn't raise my voice. I never do. "I came to give him a good death," I said. I did that. The rest was never mine to fix. I flew home 3 days later, on the ticket I'd bought before I ever walked through that door. I used to think leaving at 26 had made me free. It hadn't, not fully. I'd spent 5 years still defining myself in opposition to them, which meant some part of me was still organized around their expectations even in my absence. What happened in that room was different. I gave everything I had to a man who never apologized because I chose to, and then I left because I chose that too. Neither the giving nor the leaving was about what I owed them or what I was owed. That was the first genuinely free thing I'd ever done for that family. My mother still texts sometimes about the estate, about her own health now, about how someone reliable really ought to check in more. The word reliable still shows up, worn smooth from decades of handling. The machine didn't die with my father. It just turned looking for the next thing to run on. But I answer on my own terms now, or I don't answer at all. The phone doesn't own me the way it used to. When it lights up, my chest doesn't drop anymore. They didn't call for 5 years. Then they called 40 times in one night. And it took a dying man's hand growing cold in mine for me to finally understand the difference between being needed and being loved, and to stop needing anyone to hand me proof that I was worth keeping around. If this reminded you that caring for someone doesn't mean handing them your whole life, take that as your sign. You're allowed to give freely and still leave on the date you chose.